A new police chief steps into his precinct, dressed casually, determined to see his officers as they truly are, unfiltered, unpolished, without the veneer of protocol. But when a white officer spits in his face, thinking he's just another nobody, the entire room is moments away from a shocking revelation that will leave them reeling. It was a hot Tuesday morning in August when Richard Nelson, freshly appointed as the chief of police, parked his car in downtown Blue Ridge, a quiet city tucked in North Carolina's rolling hills. Clad in a plaid shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers, he looked nothing like the man who had spent 20 years climbing the ranks of law enforcement. That was exactly the point. Richard believed in seeing the truth for himself, not through the filtered lens of formal announcements or rehearsed greetings. As a black man stepping into a precinct with whispers of misconduct, he wanted an unvarnished look at his department. The precinct lot buzzed with officers arriving and leaving. Richard observed the casual conversations, the laughter, and the occasional glance in his direction. No one recognized him, a fact he'd ensured by keeping his arrival low-key. He adjusted his baseball cap, inhaled deeply, and carried the weight of his mission, rooting out the toxic culture hidden within these walls. Resistance was nothing new to him, but today he knew would test him in ways he hadn't imagined. Inside the precinct, the hum of chatter and ringing phones filled the air. Officers grouped around desks, swapping stories or reviewing files, paying little attention, until he reached the break room.
"Hey, you!" a sharp voice cut through the noise. Richard turned to see a white officer striding toward him with a smug grin. Officer
Daniels, flanked by a few curious onlookers.
"You lost or something? This isn't a shelter. Take that mess somewhere else," Daniels sneered, his tone dripping with condescension.
Richard froze. Before he could respond, Daniels stepped closer, raising his voice. "Didn't you
"Hear me? Get out of here! We don't need people like you hanging around."
Laughter erupted. Some officers slapped tables. Others whispered about showing the riffraff their place. Then, without warning, Daniels spat directly into Richard's face. Time seemed to stop. The warm, humiliating act sent a shock through Richard, but he remained composed. Slowly, deliberately, he wiped his face with a handkerchief. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Richard asked, calm but firm. Daniel smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong here," he said. The group laughed again, but Richard said nothing. He turned and walked away, letting the officers stew in their ignorance as he made his way to the main office. Soon, the intercom called all personnel to the briefing room. The officers filed in, some still chuckling over the earlier incident. Richard entered quietly through a side door, holding a folder, embossed with the precinct's seal. He stood just out of view, observing familiar faces, including Daniels, who leaned smugly against a wall. Captain Harris cleared his throat. "As you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. Today, I'm introducing your new leader, a man with an impressive record and a vision for this department." Richard stepped forward, each footfall deliberate. The room went silent. Daniel's smirk faltered, recognition dawning, while other officers exchanged uneasy glances. "Good morning," Richard said, voice steady. "I'm Richard Nelson. As of today, I'm your new chief of police." Silence filled the room. Daniel's face drained of color. Richard locked eyes with him, letting the moment linger. "This morning," Richard continued, "I came in plain clothes to observe the department unfiltered. What I witnessed was eye-opening. I've already seen behaviors that are not only unprofessional, but completely unacceptable." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The culture that has been allowed to fester here ends today." Daniels squirmed. Richard stepped closer, voice sharp but controlled. Respect is not optional.
It's the foundation of law enforcement. Without it, we fail, not just each other, but the
community we serve.
He recalled the morning's incident. Some of you laughed at a man you thought powerless. Let me remind you, every person who walks through these doors deserves respect, badge or not. The tension was palpable. Daniel's bravado had vanished. Richard continued, unwavering.
There will be no tolerance for behavior that disrespects the dignity of anyone, colleague, civilian, or otherwise.
He stepped down and confronted Daniels. You, Daniels, represent everything that's broken in Medina. This department. Spitting in my face wasn't just disrespecting me, it was disrespecting the people.
Badge, the oath, and the community we swore to protect.
Daniels stammered. Richard interrupted sharply. You didn't care to know. You assumed that. Man didn't matter. And that assumption is why this department has lost the community's trust. Turning to the rest of the room, he declared, "This isn't one man's mistake. It's a culture of bullying and prejudice. That stops now." Richard returned to the podium. "I've spent my career fighting for justice, not just in the streets, but within departments like this one. Change won't happen overnight, but under my leadership, this precinct will operate with integrity, respect, and accountability." He announced Daniel's suspension, emphasizing that it was just the first step in transforming the department. Officers shuffled out in stunned silence. Richard stayed, observing, letting the weight of his leadership settle in. Weeks passed, and the precinct began to change. Officers who had once laughed at Daniels now avoided him. Recruits stepped up, and Richard's consistent presence reminded everyone of the new standard. Conversations about bias and respect were met with resistance, but each small victory reinforced the shift. One day, a young boy approached Richard at a community event. "Are you really the chief?" he asked. "I am," Richard replied, kneeling to meet his gaze. "We can't change the past, but we're working to do better. And if you ever need help, come find me." By the end of his first year, the precinct wasn't perfect, but it was unmistakably different. Officers embraced accountability. The community began to trust again, and Richard knew the fight for justice inside and outside the department was worth every challenge. Change had begun, and it was just the beginning.